Hello, friends. This is the Netarts Friends Church podcast. We are Jesus people, Kingdom of God people, welcoming, yearning, sharing. And we're glad you're connecting here with us. We'd love to connect in person as well. If you're inclined to support this podcast or for more information, just hop on over to netartsfriends.org. That's netartsfriends.org. Let's jump into today's sermon. A few years ago, I ended up in the physical therapist's office trying to figure out an injury. My hips were all kinds of locked up and painful, and it was spreading into my low back. And I had both wounded parts and protective parts. And I didn't know which part was which. All I knew was that everything hurt. The muscles trying to protect my wounds were knotted and hard, trying to protect other vulnerabilities. The physical therapist had me do all kinds of stretches that created all kinds of pain. We discovered angry nerves and wounded parts and immobility that I had no idea even existed. The physical therapist was able to put his hands on certain muscles in ways that simultaneously created an excruciating feeling of I can't take one more second of it, along with that's exactly where the problem is. That's what is needed. We worked on my hips, my legs, my ankles. I realized that there were parts of me that had presented the problem and they were not actually the complete problem. In some ways, they were more of a symptom. They were my body's way of trying to cope and guard and protect much older, deeper wounds and vulnerabilities. I realized that some of what was going on had probably been going on since at least early high school. That experience serves as a metaphor for so much of the human experience. There's a way that you show up in the world. There are ways that you posture yourself, ways that you function and move and appear and make your way through the world, and people experience your personality. And sometimes those ways that you show up in the world don't completely work, or they stop working. They cause pain. There's some kind of a presenting problem. Maybe it shows up at work or with relatives, in your marriage, your family, with your kids, friendship, church, community, personal life. And some people may say, oh, that's the problem. And you might even say, oh, that's the problem, because it looks like the problem. But the thing that is presenting as the problem sometimes is actually the way you're trying to survive. It's your way of coping and trying to function and how you're compensating. And it's the way you posture yourself so that your true vulnerability, your true wound, your true weakness is protected. The thing that you're calling the problem is trying to guard a wound, a weakness that is much older and much deeper, perhaps much more vulnerable. And just like my experience at physical therapy, you don't always even realize what that deeper wound or weakness even is. Peeling back the layers of survival strategies and becoming vulnerable enough with yourself to even admit and name that wound or weakness can be every bit as excruciating and tender as having a physical therapist put his hands on your wounded parts. This brings us to our gospel story today, Luke 13:10 through 17. It's the story of a woman whose village likely thought of her as a hunchback, not a name I like to use, and a synagogue president whose village likely thought of him as one of the most respected spiritual voices in the community. We could say it's just a story that happened 2,000 years ago, and it doesn't have much of anything to do with our life today. We could say that, or we could recognize this as a story about how Jesus is interacting in our life with our weak and wounded parts and with our protective parts. Because you and I have many different parts of who we are. There are parts of you that struggle with the same thing that this hunched over woman was struggling with in this story. And there are parts of you that struggle with very similar things that the synagogue president was struggling with in this story. And Jesus speaks to you and me and interacts with aspects of our lives in similar ways. So let's jump in. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." And then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Luke tells us that this woman had lived in her community for 18 years, bent forward, bent together. When people looked at her, most of them did not see her. They saw her condition, the way she postured herself, her presenting problem, and they likely had names for her. Hunchback. She was bent forward. She couldn't stand up straight. Now, many of us could sit up straight right now or stand up straight, straighten our spine, and we could say to ourselves, well, I don't have a condition like that woman. I can straighten my back. And that may be true for you. I hope it is. But that doesn't mean you don't experience what Luke calls asthenia. Asthenia means a lack of strength. It can be emotional, it can be social, it can be bodily, it can be spiritual, economic, psychological. It can apply to the frailty of human life and human nature, economic weakness, poverty, lack of influence, lack of conviction, weakness of character, lack of self-control, uneducated. It was thought of as some kind of a native weakness. And Luke says this woman was there who had been, and it's asthenia, she was weakened by a spirit. And then he set her free from her asthenia. Now, there are other words that Luke could have used to describe this illness, but Luke chose this broader term. This woman isn't the only one with a posture that people saw her for. We too have adaptive stances, maladaptive stances, ways that we posture ourselves in the world. And in relationships, there are ways that you bend yourself and you compensate and you contort yourself and you try to avoid pain. Ways that you try to quench unmet thirst. Ways of surviving and performing and coping and functioning. And people come to know you for that posture, for that stance. They almost expect you to show up like that. They see your stance as your identity, as who you are. Have you ever had someone say, oh, that's just Tom being Tom, or, fill in your name there? They look at you and that's what they see. They expect you to show up like that. You may have been like that for 18 years. But underneath your posture, there's something much more vulnerable. It's something that can be difficult to name or put your finger on. It is the story underneath the places where you are bent. And Luke calls it your weakness. It's the place where your deepest vulnerabilities lie. The place where you actually feel the most weakness, the greatest lack of confidence, your deepest feelings of inadequacy, limitation, debilitation, incapacity, maybe childhood wounds, might be what you wish you received as a child but didn't, love, attunement to needs, words that you needed to hear. It may be your deepest longings and thirsts that feel unmet, unquenched. It might be scars or traumatic experiences, things that you believe about yourself, but they're too vulnerable to admit or say out loud. Behind the places where you hunch, behind your adaptive stance in this world, there are wounds and unanswered needs and traumas and weakness. This is your asthenia. It's the same thing that Luke is talking about with this woman. For some people, even getting this far, even admitting that something like weakness, something like asthenia exists, feels massively vulnerable. It's way easier to just say, no, this is a story about a lady way back when, than to let this story get very close. So I did some reading this past week about the social experience of people with bent spines, people who get called hunchbacks. One of the main things they talk about is how everyone notices you, but hardly anyone actually sees you. When people see you, if you have a hunched spine, all they see is your bent spine. So whether they're calling you mean names or not, because that's a really sad part of the reading, is people talk about getting called the camel or different names. But whether people are calling you a name or not, when they are interacting with you, they seem so preoccupied thinking about your bent spine that it causes you to feel invisible. This is the writing of people who live with this condition. This is how they say it is. Even though your bent spine causes you to stick out like a sore thumb, people don't relate to you or know you as a person outside of your condition. Luke tells us that Jesus saw this woman. Jesus sees you. He doesn't just notice your condition, he sees you, the true you, all of the truth about you. Jesus said, "Woman, you are set free from your asthenia." And he put his hands on her. You're set free from your weakness. Jesus wasn't just touching this woman's bent spine. He wasn't just putting his hands on the symptom. He was setting her free, loosing her from her weakness, her wounds, so that she could stand tall. And this story isn't only a story that happened back when, it's a story that's still happening. Jesus, the great physician, like a physical therapist, knows how to touch, how to put his hands on your wounds, on your weakness, which might simultaneously create feelings of angry nerves and wounded parts and excruciating pain. And I can't take one more second of it. And self-discovery and self-awareness, like, oh, I had no idea that I was this immobile. I didn't know that this was the weakness I was trying to protect. And relief, feeling seen and known. Yes, that is where the problem is. That's the thirst that I'm experiencing. That's what I need. When Jesus puts his hands on that wound, on that weakness, and heals you, he doesn't change your posture for you. Jesus doesn't stand you up. You get to participate in the healing. You get to change your posture. Jesus sets you free from your weakness, and you get to stand up tall. When you have lived with any posture, with any condition for 18 years, it becomes so normalized, so habitual, so ingrained, so ordinary that it begins to feel like your identity, like who you are. It's who people expect you to be. Your entire life has become shaped around guarding that wounded part of you or compensating for that weakness. And so you hardly know a different way of being. This is true of our physical bodies, and it's true of other aspects of our life. In order to stand tall, you have to be willing to break an old dead shell of who you were, what your life was, and engage muscles that have atrophied, back muscles, hip muscles, abdominal muscles, glutes. You're opening up your hip joints. You're releasing hip flexors that haven't opened up for 18 years. To stand tall means that you're now functioning in the world from a completely different posture. It's from a different perspective, from an adjusted identity. You used to be looking at the floor. You used to be looking at everyone's feet. And now you can look people in the eye. Jesus doesn't only want to heal your wounded parts. He wants to heal your protective parts. And that brings us to the story of the synagogue leader, the synagogue president. Luke continues, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, there are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath. When you stand tall, you encounter resistance. You encounter protective parts. And they really mean well, but they are counterproductive. That resistance might come from within yourself or from others. Like we said earlier, part of you is like the woman who Jesus healed, and part of you is like the synagogue leader who also needed Jesus' healing. Standing tall doesn't make everyone happy. There are people who are offended. You aren't following their schedule, their rules, their theology, their interpretation of Scripture. Have you ever experienced your body trying to do something protective, but it turned out to be counterproductive? Your protective parts mean well. They really do. But sometimes they become overactive or rigid in ways that actually block the healing, or they restrict mobility. So I invite you to see that same dynamic, not only in this synagogue leader, but consider the way that your protective parts within you do the same thing. So in order to understand this synagogue leader and his protective intent, we have to understand what was at stake for this synagogue ruler. It was Sabbath keeping. It was at the heart of Jewish identity and Jewish piety. It was what distinguished the people of Israel from all the nations around them. It was the marker of national identity. Sabbath keeping was one of the commands that came from the beginning of creation, from the Garden of Eden. It was a command repeated in the Ten Commandments, in Exodus, in Deuteronomy, and for century upon century, the very best minds and the very best hearts of Jewish rabbis had been talking and teaching and writing about how to keep the Sabbath. So for this synagogue leader, how do you go against what the very best theological minds and interpreters of Scripture have been saying for hundreds of years? That's what was at stake for him. The Mishnah was their very best articulation of what's allowed and what's not allowed on the Sabbath. It was a piece of very important writing that interpreted the law. There were entire tractates, 240 paragraphs on Sabbath behavior and regulations, what is allowed, what's not allowed on the Sabbath. And it said specifically that healing on the Sabbath is allowed only in critical cases like life and death. It's not for chronic conditions like this woman, something she's been dealing with for 18 years. So this was no small potatoes issue. It was the heart and soul of following Yahweh's commands. And what had just happened with this woman in this synagogue ruler's synagogue was not only an embarrassing violation of Sabbath keeping. He didn't only have to ask himself, well, what are people in town going to say if they hear about this? Or what will the people in other villages say? He had to ask himself, what is Yahweh saying about this? This synagogue ruler dared not get Sabbath keeping wrong. And so he responded to what had just happened in the most generous way possible. He didn't address Jesus or the woman at all. He spoke to the people, and he said, there are 6 days for work. Come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath. And who could really fault him for that? He wasn't stopping Jesus from healing. He wasn't stopping people who needed healing from receiving it. He was just trying to say, can we do it on a different day? Can you see what this synagogue ruler was trying to protect? He was trying to stand up for God and for the Sabbath and for Jewish identity, and he meant well. And there are a lot of people who mean well when they try to stand up for God, when they try to stand up for some kind of identity. This is our who we are. Luke continues. The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" If you're a dog or a cat owner, I invite you to think about your food and water routine every morning with your pet. We have cats and dogs in our living room, but we don't have donkeys or oxen in our living rooms, because that would be unthinkable to us. But it was actually commonplace to the people Jesus was talking to. The common construction of first century homes was an open living space with pillars, and between the pillars there was often a manger for the animals, and every night you brought good old Bessie or good old Eeyore or whoever the donkey or the oxen was inside the house, and you tied them up. They were one of your most valuable possessions. They helped warm the house. You used their dung as fuel. And every morning you untied good old Bessie or Eeyore and you led them out to water where they could get a drink. This was commonplace. But what about on the Sabbath? Were you allowed to untie Bessie or Eeyore and lead them out to get a drink? This was a conversation that the rabbis had down through the centuries, and they had already hammered this out. Like, of course, even on the Sabbath, you're allowed to loose good old Bessie or Eeyore. You can untie them and you can give them water, even on the Sabbath. We're not monsters. Showing mercy to our animals is permitted, even on the Sabbath. It was unthinkable that you would leave a thirsty Bessie or Eeyore tied up inside the house all day, unable to get a drink. Can you see what Jesus was saying? Kind of like an inflamed or knotted muscle that's trying to be protective, but it's actually blocking healing. Jesus' approach to healing within this community, he wasn't trying to crush that knotted protective muscle. He was changing the relationship between the protective part and the wounded part. It was providing lateral thinking. It was to tell the protective part that there's actually something good that they are doing every day, and showing them how to lean into that good and extend that good and celebrate offering that good action to the wounded part. Jesus used the same verb to loose or to untie or to set free, both for thirsty old Bessie and for this woman who had been crippled, bent over. Jesus called the woman forward, and he named her as a daughter of Abraham. How much more valuable was she than the other members of the family who slept every night in the living room? How much more valuable than good old Bessie or Eeyore? Now, the reason this part of the healing mattered so much was that in the ancient world, the experience of illness, part of that experience that was so difficult was that your social networks were disrupted. You lost value within your village, within your community. You lost meaning as a person within your community. It had to do with ancient understandings of sin and sickness going together. And so part of being healed, part of standing tall, was having people receive you back into your community. You had to be restored to your community. Healing didn't only mean restoring biomedical functioning, it meant being returned to a valued state within your community and having people actually see you as a legitimate person, an important part of their village. And so Jesus was inviting people to use all of their care, all their empathy that they had for their thirsty animals after just one night and apply it to this woman who had been tied up for 18 years. How thirsty must this daughter of Abraham be? Why would we not set her free? This is the Jesus who said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, the year of Sabbath." I want to close today by inviting you into a guided prayer exercise. I invite you to close your eyes and ask Jesus to help you feel, help you notice where it is within yourself that you are bent. What is your protective posture? Where do you say to yourself, I shouldn't be thirsty like this. I shouldn't feel this weak. I shouldn't feel this needy. I'm not supposed to take up space like this or make a scene like this. This part of me is too vulnerable. This is the part that has to remain hidden. Ask Jesus, where is my protective posture? And how does that protective posture affect the way that I relate to myself and to others? So take a moment not to provide yourself with the answer, but to listen. What is the answer that Jesus is bringing to you? Jesus invites you to see yourself waking up every morning, taking your dog for a walk, feeding the cat, letting them out, freshening their water, having them sit on your lap. If you aren't a pet person, maybe you think about watering a plant or a friend that you regularly check in with. Nearly all of us know the experience of caring for something thirsty, something dependent, something tender, valuable, precious to us. Take a moment to simply get in touch for a moment with that simple care and how good you actually are at offering that care, the way that you extend that mercy. I invite you to imagine Jesus coming to that place where you are bent, to that wounded part, your protective part. And Jesus invites you to accept the same kind of mercy that you are so good at extending to your own dog, to your own cat, to your own plant, to your own friend. I invite you to imagine the healing touch of Jesus on that part within you that is weak and thirsty. Imagine Jesus untying you, loosing you, inviting you to drink and to be led beside quiet waters. And Jesus names that most vulnerable part of you as a full and valuable part of the family, the village, the community. You are a son of Abraham. You are a daughter of Abraham. Jesus invites you to no longer stand in that old protective posture. What does this mean to accept this healing? To stand tall. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me out beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and your love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in your house, the house of the Lord, forever. Thank you for joining us for a Sunday sermon from Netart's Friends Church. We hope you'll join us soon for one of our in-person worship gatherings. For more information, hop on over to netartsfriends.org. God's peace be with you, friends.